Okay, we'll keep faith to the time and get going. We're doing a panel today. First of all, I hope you've had a great data center world so far. So far, good? Okay. Doesn't sound too much enthusiasm, but I get it. Okay. We're doing a panel today on alternative energy sources, nuclear, geothermal, hydrogen, oceanic, and more. Obviously, if you've been even to a single session, power and energy have come up as kind of topics du jour. Today we have an incredible panel of three people who really do know their stuff, and we've designed this panel to be conversational, provocative, and certainly to leave you with food for thought. So. Right here on my direct left, Brian Smith. He's the Director of Nuclear Reactor Development at Idaho National Labs. We have Dan or Daniel? Dan Crosby, the founder and CEO of Legend Energy Advisors, and Doug Bernauer, the founder and CEO of Radiant Nuclear. So I'm going to start with a couple questions, and then I think let's just go free form, right? So alternative energy sources for data centers and adjacent spaces. Is this reality? Is this rhetoric?
Okay, I'll start with that. Thank you for appreciate that. Thanks for having us, and thanks to all of you for being here. Is it a reality? I'd say, well, yeah. I mean, where I sit at Idaho National Laboratories. So some of you may have been in the nuclear workshop I had yesterday. If you were there, thank you. If you weren't, you missed a good one. But I mentioned in that session there's 17 national laboratories across the United States. If you're a taxpayer in this country, you should be real proud that you do that. Those are owned by the Department of Energy. It's a super cool network that a lot of people don't know about, but Idaho National Laboratory is one of them. We focus on nuclear energy research, development, demonstration, deployment. We're helping with commercialization strategies to include data centers. And so where we sit with research on nuclear energy, how to harness nuclear energy, not just for power, but for industrial applications, the data center community has heavily been engaging with us. I've been doing what I can to get out there and engage with you all. That's why I'm here this week. That's why I'm on the road most weeks, because you all need power. And right, and the same chart is being shown this week all over this conference, that chart that goes up at an alarming rate in terms of power demand in this country, largely driven by data centers. So does the status quo meet that demand? I think all of us can look at that chart and say, yeah, no, we're not going to get there with the status quo. There's got to be something else that comes into the mix. That's where we sit at Idaho National Laboratory, being that we're the leaders in nuclear energy RD&D. We see that as an opportunity for this industry, among many others. So I think the answer from where I sit is yes.
Okay. Dan, rhetoric or reality?
I think kind of one of the interesting things is alternative energy for a long time has been thought of as wind and solar and alternatives to fossil fuels. But if you look at the data center space, they've always pulled power from the grid. So this whole concept of on-site energy in itself is alternative energy. And the question is, how are you going to go about doing that? As the non-nuclear guy on the panel, apparently, I'll talk about everything else. But right now it's all about speed. And so, there's a whole bunch of technology, which I've been a proponent of nuclear for a long time. I did a podcast, I think, 6 months or a year ago. And one of the things, eventually cars are going to come fully fueled for the life of that car, just like our submarines do. Because energy density is what matters. And I think what you're finding with the racks and how they're also exponentially increasing, the amount of megawatts that are going on an acre is going through the roof. And so I think, long term, that's where nuclear has, real capability, as it is by far and away the most dense form of power we have. But it's also not going to be funding or fueling 2026 and 2025. And so there's a whole bunch of other technologies that are going to have to bridge that gap, which these guys have a better view on when that gap is going to close. So a lot of what we're doing in this space right now is how do we get power now? How do we get reliable power now based on these data centers, a lot of them looking a lot more like an arc furnace than a traditional data center? And then how do we prepare for that eventual form of energy that is going to be very dense and load following?
Excellent. Doug, same question. Reality, rhetoric?
Hi, I'm Doug Bernauer. So maybe I'll explain a little bit about myself. I worked at SpaceX for 12 years. I left in 2019, founded a company called Radiant, focused on making a 1 megawatt portable nuclear reactor, mass producing nuclear for the first time ever. We've been working closely with Idaho National Laboratory for a long time. Last week, there was an announcement from the Department of Energy that we will get the fuel that we need for this project, meaning fuel will go in a reactor next year at Brian's laboratory. It'll be the 53rd reactor that's ever been tested there, the last one being in 1977. So it's really real and coming really soon.
Excellent. Okay, I'm gonna fast forward. I'm gonna give a stat, and then I'm gonna fast forward for a couple years. So, right now in the U.S., estimates are that data centers take about 3% of total power, slated to be about 10% in a short 5 years. So, let's fast forward 5 years, and let's posit that data centers are run on what I call an energy stack, right? They're different sources. Give me some percentages here. What's it gonna look like? You know, fission, nuclear fission, wind, solar, whatever, and then maybe even if my company's at all successful, nuclear fusion as well. So give me a sense of this energy stack, what it looks like.
The non-nuclear guy gets the next 5 years.
Yeah. Okay.
That's not ironic. So, I mean, I think everybody's kind of come to the conclusion that right now it's gas, or gas. If you're looking for firm, reliable power. That's just the reality of where we are. There's been some massive dynamic changes in grids. If you look at what happened in the Texas grid over the last 15 years, we had a massive proliferation of wind, which completely changed the dynamics of the grid. We then built the CREZ project to move that wind around. Now we've gone full boat on solar over the last, 7 years. Over the last several years, batteries have gone nuts. The ancillary market has gotten crushed. Reg up, reg down is now owned by batteries. So the entire dynamics of how the grid works and gas's economics has been really challenging until all of a sudden you need a ton of power and you need it right now and it needs to run all day, every day. Right. And so that, I think if I had to make a prediction over the next 5 years, an overwhelming majority of this is going to come from gas, especially for on-site. The density of solar and wind just aren't going to facilitate that. They'll be big contributors to the grid. But one of the big challenges that you're dealing with is on the economics of on-site gen is the data center's got to subsidize that. And the generators are going to have to do a lot of things that you can't afford to do as a generator for the, toward the market, toward the utility. And so my prediction for the next 5 years is an overwhelming majority of that's going to be gas with this technology starting to feather in.
Doug, yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Well, so I was just going to say, nuclear, recognize we have nuclear today, and whether you know it or not, nuclear provides about 20% of the nation's electricity today. That's with 94 operating reactors, putting about 97 gigawatts of power on the grid. So it's a very real thing in the United States, and what we're trying to do in partnership with companies like Doug's and some others. I mean, take Radiant for example. And Doug, I won't speak for you. By the way, when you Doug is when I do nuclear talks, I'm always like the charismatic, energetic one on the panel. You had to pick like the one person in the industry who's as charismatic and energetic as I am. So thanks a lot. But I'm just a big fan of Doug and what they do. But so he's going to test his reactor, demonstrate the reactor at Idaho National Laboratory only in a year or so. That's going to prove the principle so that these things can actually then start rolling off out of a factory, through an assembly line. So as I look to 5 years, now first of all, one comment on that is, say data centers, you suck up something like 4%, 3% of the power in this country is projected to go to something like 9 or 10%. I really think that's quaint. I think we're going to, you all have seen the way that curve goes up. You revisit it every 6 months. So I used to work at Department of Energy, and part of the DOE, semi-autonomous part, is the Energy Information Administration. They keep updating these forecasts. EPRI does too. And the forecasts keep going up. You revisit it 6 months later, I have to update my talking points and say, well, it's going to take up more than this. So I think in 5 years, we're looking at, even more. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. You all have great guesses on that. So do I see nuclear being a part of that? Well, yeah, our existing reactors today, the Palisades plant in Michigan, that's 800 megawatts of power. It was shut down down a few years ago. That's going to come back online through the efforts of a company called Holtec. The 3 Mile Island Unit 1 plant that's being rebranded, is the Crane Clean Energy Center, and in a partnership with Microsoft, that's going to come back on the line. That alone puts almost 2 gigawatts of energy back onto the grid. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, in partnership with the Department of Energy and Idaho National Laboratory for some foundational research, is looking at uprating existing nuclear reactors. Those 94 reactors that I mentioned, there are a number of them that can actually work in a more efficient way and put more power on the grid. So, do we take the existing fleet and rise higher than 20%? Well, maybe. I think some wonderful points were made about other energy sources that will be coming on the grid. But what I look at in the next 5-year window is that opportunity for those widespread deployments of those smaller reactors. Megawatt isn't much, but when Doug starts rolling those off the assembly line, that's really going to start changing the equation on the nuclear piece that's currently about 1/5.
Doug, you had a wonderful emissary here in Brian, but if you could add to that as well.
Thank you. I only know about what I know about. That's why I handed the mic over earlier. Right, I'm making a 1 megawatt reactor. My job is to beat diesel generators. That's a really hard customer, or a really hard competitor, right, for me. And the way it works is we make a reactor that's mass produced. That tiny reactor, even though it's only 1 megawatt, we can have about 1,000 of them out in the world. So about a gigawatt could be these tiny microreactors. And those would be in all the areas you'd never imagine there being a reactor. So they'd be extremely off-grid locations, places like islands, places like out in the Arctic. So you can have these Northern Slope, Alaska, subsistence whaling villages that have only diesel today, and they could instead actually having access to a really clean form of power that gives them 5 years of energy. This stability that means they don't have to have giant storage tanks that'll outlast the frozen seas, which is how they get new oil supplies. So a bunch of really cool little things we can do with it. I think one of the giant benefits will be to these larger systems. As Brian said, we start getting these cranked out, we're going to learn things about mass production. We're going to learn things about regulation in the modern world. Being able to take all of the data from 1,000 reactors out there and streaming it all back, and then using machine learning models to go, okay, which unit is doing something weird we've never seen before. That we don't do today, and there'll be huge benefits. And I think that could be a big advantage with upgrading the existing fleet, which would be a huge energy boon, right? I think we have something like 500 gigawatts of electric power production in the U.S., but I think that's only gone up by about 15% since 2000, whereas the rest of the world has doubled electric power. The global number is doubling, not 15%. So we've got to get building again. And I've got my little slice of it that I can do with Brian's help, and then we'll unfold as much as we can and share lessons learned with industry and the regulator.
Just as an aside, we had some nuclear representation, gas. From a worldwide perspective, right, India, China, Indonesia, largely coal. Right, so there's still there's a lot of fossil fuels still involved, of course, in powering the today, right? And so the question then is, what's the tension or the tyranny of what we need now versus how we project out? And so I think that's what we're all sort of grappling with, right? Quick question on the hyperscalers, the big, the Microsofts, Googles, Metas. Each one of them has made announcements over the last 6 months, not only of a massive amount of dollar investment in data centers, largely driven by the AI workload, et cetera, but also, around nuclear, right? Whether it's 3 Mile Island, whether it's captive nuclear plants, whether it's investing in small modular reactors, that sort of thing. Could you just give some commentary on, once again, are those numbers sensible? We're talking about $500-600 billion of pledged investments. And are there elephants in the room around perhaps those being hyperbolic? Why don't you start with you, Brian?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Are they sensible? Yeah, I mean, you talked about the investment dollars. There are a lot of investors, and we're engaged. I only retired from Department of Energy in January, so I'm barely an INL guy, except DOE owns INL, right? And so I've kind of managed the programs at INL for much of my career, and so joining the lab was just an easy transition. But from my government role, at my last role, I was acting as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Reactors. And in that role, I convened, along with a team of people, convened some of those very companies that you just mentioned, along with utilities, along with project developers, first in the Secretary's office, the Secretary of Energy's office, and then in a couple of follow-on meetings with some other actors along the way. I had some Department of Defense folks, the nuclear vendors. The point of those convenings was to get those various equities sitting around a table, not trading emails and saying how, well, I'm not going to act, well, I'm not going to act, well, the risk profile doesn't look good, no, it doesn't look good to me either. The stalemate, right? We talk in nuclear about the stalemate. That's what has, in some ways, and we could have a whole nother session about the nuclear renaissance that never was. I don't like that word. I won't use that word. That word has baggage. We're in a nuclear revolution now because it is different, because in November of 2022, ChatGPT came out, right? And I was a professional staff member with the House Appropriations Committee when ChatGPT came out. And it was a really big deal because all of a sudden it was like, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, no, we don't have near enough power in this country to do whatever this new thing is. And so as we transitioned into 2023, 2024, we had these convenings in the Department of Energy, starting with the Secretary of Energy herself. And I don't want to put too much of a closed discussion out there in the public sphere, but we're all friends, right? Because we're in the room and the door's shut. But the secretary told those people around the table, I'm tired of listening to all of you say why it has to be someone else that has to move first. I want you all to figure out how to manage this risk and get to work. And sure enough, you saw through the course of 2024, some deals came together. Well, guess what? Those were the people in the room when those conversations were being had. So we brought those people together under the banner called Fission for the Future. It was this idea that we could get them in the room and actually start working on economic models, deployment models that might make sense. I wasn't going to write that. I'm not smart enough to write what the deployment model, I'm not going to tell you all what deployment model makes sense, how you all should absorb risk in this kind of partner portfolio. But if we can sit in the room and I can facilitate those discussions as a government leader, awesome. And we've seen some of those come together, and they have different flavors. Some of them involve direct investment in the reactor companies. Some of them are long-term PPAs. Hey, I'm agnostic on what works, but as long as something works and we get past the stalemate. Because when you start talking about that power demand that we've got that rises and rises, you're looking at a time when there's no energy available, right? I don't know what the economic model is for you all when you start looking. Today you look at something, well, maybe I'll do gas, maybe I'll use some renewables here, I'll use some battery storage. Yeah, that's great when those options are available. When there's no energy available, the whole economic model is upset.
Dan, could you comment on that, about $600 billion of pledges? Does that make sense to you? Do you see that kind of, you're every day in the market, with your finger to the pulse? Are you seeing stuff?
There's a ton of gating items. So to your point earlier, if you look at power generation and demand in the United States from like 1950 to early 2000, it's just up and to the right. And if you look at power demand and what we've generated and consumed from like really the early 2000, maybe 2002 to 22, it's flat. And the reason for that isn't we weren't using more power, is efficiency was just devouring demand. LEDs and control systems and VFDs and all these things were completely demolishing the growth in demand through efficiency efforts that we were doing. And then to your point, all of a sudden we had this industry that decided I'm going to build a refinery there, and there. For those of us that have been in the industrial space and doing transmission interconnections for a decade, those things always take 3 years. Right? There's massive amounts of planning. There's 345 kV breakers. There's transformers. There's lines that have to be built, right of way that has to be secured. So all of this has always taken time, and everybody in the data center space is kind of shocked at why is it 5 years? Well, it's because everybody and their brother said they were going to build a data center. I mean, right now in Encore territory in Texas, the entire Texas market is an 86 gigawatt grid. There are 80 gigawatts of interconnection requests in South Dallas. So if I'm an engineering group at a transmission operator and I'm trying to study how I'm going to add the entire load of Texas to a small geographic region, like what do I even study? It's not real. So normally when we'd have people get back to us in 3 weeks, we're not hearing anything for 9 months because one, half the transmission group has been poached and now works for a data center developer, and the other half is trying to deal with imaginary demand that someone has literally written $1 million check, a whole bunch of people have written $1 million checks, and that's not stopping it. So there's a massive challenge in the queue of what's real for the utilities, which makes a challenge for these nuke plants. Even if you ramp up the production, the transmission capacity isn't there, and that goes back to our density problem, which I think nuclear solves in the long term. But the reality is you're not going to get a 345 kV transmission interconnection anywhere in the United States in the next 3 years if you start right now. Like, that's just not happening. And so how this all transpires, and I think that goes back to your point of how much is this actually going to be real. What's going to be real is what gets generated on site. If it's not already in the interconnection or queue, like we have a couple of projects right now that we're kicking off breaker and a half stations that are now under construction. That will be online in less than 36 months. We'll have a couple hundred megawatts of power in those sites in 18. So, but then on-site power is what matters, and I think these kind of solutions are going to be great, but they're not here in 26, 27, which is where all the finance dollars are going after, and that is where gas has to play a role now. And even if you look at the queue on generators and turbines, all that stuff's getting pushed out. People are buying slots, it's getting gobbled up. So there's a lot of challenges to making this happen.
Right, so between the rhetoric and the reality, there's time and resources and so on. Doug, any comments on the same question?
The answers given already were pretty good. I think, though, there is interest from data center companies on even the really, really small size. And I think I haven't highlighted one of the unique things about a 1 megawatt portable reactor, and this is that you can build 50 reactors per year. We'll move from early financing to being able to just crank them off of a production line, Radiant self-financing some of those things, so that you could, over a weekend, suddenly have a 5-year-long 1 megawatt power source. Which means for people who go to the utility and they go, hey, I want power, they don't have to get on a 3-year-long list. They don't have to go add $1 million per mile power lines that take 3 to 5 years to install. They can just put in a nuclear power system. And the 1 megawatt nuclear reactor, you shut it down, wait 30 days, we pick it up on a truck, it goes back to the factory with the fuel inside. There's no nuclear thing about it. It's just clean power in a package that's long lasting.
Right.
It'll only do this little slice. But it could even be a thing you get while you're building a bigger reactor. Maybe you want really 5 or 10 megawatts, and you use some of our units on site until your construction's complete. So it allows businesses to just make a business decision to beat their competition, have power before everyone else, and succeed that way.
Okay. So I want to move to, I said earlier on we're going to be a little provocative, right? So let's go to the provocative side. Because after all, why are you sitting here, right? You don't want to hear the same thing over and over again. There's a thing about, conferences in general. You've come here because you're interested in a space, and when you're interested in it or you have a business in it, we all tend to think of things going up to the right? We have a very positivist view. We're going to keep on growing and so on. I'm going to make a couple statements. They may not reflect what I think, but they're still important from the perspective of covering all sides. You mentioned ChatGPT. Dan, you mentioned up to the right. Doug, you talked about at small nuclear reactors, portable, built in a factory, and so on and so forth. And a lot of this is predicated on the growth of AI, growth of crypto, and so on and so forth. The last 4 months, we've seen some interesting things in the news. Call it 6 months. First, we saw DeepSeek coming online, right? Second, we've seen, and this is public information, some large companies backing out of data center leases, right? And third is we've seen a lot of skepticism from certain quarters around AI outside of the consumer, right? So like B2B, real B2B deep vertical applications. Could those be pointing to a bubble, which therefore should ease some of our excitement around the growth we've been talking about? Just what are your comments on that? We can start with you, Doug.
I'm not a financial analyst. I really don't have an opinion on it. Okay. I'll pass the mic to someone who might.
Okay. I'm guessing these two gentlemen have opinions.
I got a lot of opinions. I think, to me, having operated in industrial environments for a long time, I don't use ChatGPT, maybe I should, because I can't spell and I'm dyslexic. But when I look at industrial environments that we operate in a lot of kind of traditional where this whole generation transmission space has been, there's some really tough, nasty, difficult jobs. And when I see some of the robotics that are coming out to be able to run those plants, 3 shifts, 24/7 with no one getting hurt, I think there's massive implications there in the data center space because all of that has to live in a data center somewhere. Some of that will be on-prem, a lot of it won't. And so I think that the demand overall is very real. Obviously there's been some stuff between Microsoft, ChatGPT, and all that kind of stuff's in the news, and there's obviously a whole bunch of stuff behind the scenes there. But at the end of the day, a lot of this is going to be constrained by power. I mean, and I think that's, people are starting to grasp how absurd this volume of power is, and they're, in our world, like 5 years ago, a 600 megawatt LNG terminal was a big deal, and people are like, well, we're going to build a 2 gigawatt campus, and it's like, oh, okay. You know how long those projects have typically taken to fund, and I think one of the unique things here is there is an insane volume of capital at an insane velocity trying to fly at this space. And I think a lot of that capital is starting to realize that a lot of the people in this space didn't know anything about it 2 years ago. And a lot of the lead times and just physical implications, forget all the stuff that's going on with tariffs and everything else. Building this volume of power, building this volume of data centers is just immense. And so we're already starting to see some of that bubble pop on the land side. I mean, there was just some completely insane stuff that, land values and deposits put down, and you just can't, especially when the utilities slowed down, we started to see a whole bunch of that land bubble start to pop. And so I think you're going to see more of that. There's going to be, we've already seen a number of broken projects. I got a substation in Texas that's sitting on a lot that they're trying to sell. Crypto projects a lot of stuff is starting to stumble and break just because of the velocity and volume of capital that has to keep moving. And so I think you're going to see more of that. Am I a believer in AI and this is a national security thing? It's going to completely transform our lives, and absolutely, like there's no question. I mean, I wonder if you're going to interact with a keyboard and a mouse in a couple of years. And so where all that goes, I have no idea. That's not my bailiwick. But how this gets deployed and the tactics in moving very quickly, especially in the next 3 years, is a very complex environment to make even 10% of this happen.
Right. Brian, we talked a little bit about it. Are we dealing with the bubble, or are we dealing with something that is more linear and predictable?
Yeah, that's a great question, and frankly, I would put myself with everybody else in this. Everybody in this room who was at this conference and made the effort to get out here probably has just as an informed opinion on that. I think it's fair to say we're all here because we believe it's not a bubble, or at the very least. Look, I'll recognize that there are investor dollars chasing certain investments that are not going to pan out.
Absolutely.
Is that in the form of a burst bubble? No, I don't think so, given every conversation that I have. The ways the nuclear industry is looking to leverage AI, for example. We weren't doing that 5 years ago. There was no talk. There was very little talk, except among some real geeks at the labs, about using AI to run reactors, autonomous operations. Like, that wasn't a thing. It's now a thing. How are we going to do AI to run reactors, but with the things, the services, and the infrastructure you all provide? We're not going to get there. And that's one of a million different industries. For nuclear, I'll say, it's the pedal is to the floor for nuclear, not just because of your industry. Consider all the various other use cases that I'm involved in. Did you know that 10 of Doug's reactors lined up together for desalination, so making fresh water from, say, ocean water, would provide each day about 10 Olympic-sized swimming pools of fresh water. 10 Olympic-sized swimming pools. With 10 of those of Doug's reactors, you could provide fresh drinking water to an entire town in Africa. Like, every day. I mean, that's super cool. Industries, petrochemical industries that come to us and say, hey, we want to use the high heat from particular types of reactors for particular process. Okay, cool. We got programs for that. So we're all in on nuclear. We, and not just Idaho National Laboratory. The nuclear sector is all in, not just because of the demands we see on power. But I got a little off topic. Is this what we're talking about at this conference? Is this a bubble? I'm in conversations every day with people, you all, and I have no indication that this thing's going to let up.
That's great. I'm going to make I'm going to use the power of the mic really quick. I think when Doug and Brian both referred to nuclear, you were talking about fission. Fusion has 4 times the energy density of fission. and does not produce waste.
Now you're being provocative.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
All right, we'll take the jackets off and go at it here.
The jackets. Okay, let's do something a little more interesting than us talking. Any questions about any questions or comments? Please, if you could use the mic. I've been asked to ask people to go to the mic so it's audible. If you don't mind, ma'am. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Siri Hedreen. I'm a reporter with S&P Global Platts, and this question is kind of for the room. For data centers like interested in clean-ish power, like what do you think of gas with carbon capture? And I'm just curious, like, is anyone here taking that seriously, or do they have a reason why they really don't think it'll work? If you want to like come find me, I'll be over here.
Carbon capture off of a gas plant is really tough. The economics are hard because of the volume of air. So if you already have a technology where the carbon's being removed, a lot of the gas plants are doing that. Net Power has a solution that they actually have a test unit right now. I was down there in LaPorte a couple weeks ago, where that's supercritical CO2. So any kind of solution where your CO2 is already in a form that you can easily sequester, I think is going to work. But direct air capture off the back of a combined cycle plant it's tough to get the economics on that to work.
Doug, please go ahead.
That was a great answer. I just wanted to say we use supercritical CO2, so if you capture it, we can buy it. Ours is in a closed loop, so it's not released, but we're a customer for that captured CO2.
Wow, commerce happening right here on stage.
That's what we use the hype to make the deals that make it last, right?
Yeah. Sir, please go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick question. What's the footprint of a 1 meg reactor?
4 megawatts in 4,000 square feet.
Okay, that's a clap. Let's give him a clap for that. Yeah.
I want to sell 4.
Yeah. Did you have a question, sir? Yeah, please, or a comment?
Well, comment, question. So I think we all want to see SMRs. That it's a good solution to a big problem.
Small modular reactors, for those who
Small
don't know.
modular reactors.
Yeah.
How do you unwind 50 years of education saying that every reactor, no matter what it is a potential Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island? That's the biggest problem. And how do you unwind it? Because you're not going to see it. You're not going to see reactors in Ashburn. If you see them, you're going to see them in remote areas where you don't have the public scrutiny quite to the same level. But you got to unwind that. We've got to get back into the education and say, nuke is good, not an evil.
Okay, yeah, so who would like that,
Yeah.
Is there a
absolutely
pall
accurate.
cast over nuclear because of the Fukushima, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island?
There was, and there's absolutely a need for education. It's a really great comment. I 100% agree. I know that Department of Energy already engages in a lot of education campaigns. Companies like Radiant will be doing more in that space because we're in full agreement with that. I'm sure Brian has something good to say here, so I'll try not to steal all the thunder. But largely, those disasters that occurred caused a lack of customers, right? There has not been a single case where a committed reactor developer and their customer have gone to the NRC and not gotten approval. They just haven't gotten there. So what we saw was a lapse in customers, a lapse in need and demand for reactors, and that is now completely turned around as of only like 18 months ago. But there's absolutely a need for re-education. Just people to actually hear about nuclear and understand it, not from disasters, but from the fundamentals of the technology.
Brian, do you have a comment there?
Yeah. I'm sorry you didn't bring this up. What did we do last year? Right? You did the thing at Radiant. So they're in Los Angeles, and I went from Washington, D.C. to Los Angeles, which I will do anytime I'm invited. I live in D.C. I'll go to L.A. But Radiant did a passive cool down demonstration, right? I raised that as one example. We talk about a lot of these new reactor technologies, especially with a lot of these smaller reactors. There are these passive and inherent safety features. Doug had quite an event, invited me out. I represented the Department of Energy. I gave some comments. I was honored to be there. And they did a passive, they had a giant hunk of metal that was essentially their reactor, and they ran a real-time demonstration, what's called passive cool down demonstration, to show that the reactor can actually cool itself down even in a loss of power scenario. That's a really big deal, and I'll just I note that, and you can see that whole thing, and you can see my brilliant comments that day if you go to the Radiant webpage. But But
Humility, great,
I
very
want to
humble.
reinforce that with something that this is a story that I tell to most audiences, and I did it most recently in London, where this really resonated with them. So April 1986, right, Chernobyl. And that's really, in London, they're really into that. They have that kind of European view of nuclear, and some of it is colored by Chernobyl. Well, you know, that happened in April 1986. You know what else happened in April 1986? At Idaho National Laboratory, we had a reactor. It's since been shut off, and actually, I don't mean to keep bringing it back to Doug, but Radiant is going to be put, that reactor, that 53rd reactor Doug mentioned, their reactor is going to be turned on at Idaho National Laboratory. It's going into the structure, containment structure, that used to house the EBR-2 reactor, experimental breeder reactor. We were running that as a liquid sodium fast reactor for decades at Idaho National Laboratory. We ran all kinds of tests there. In April of 1986, I think it was April 4th, it was overnight from the 3rd to the 4th, we ran 2 tests. We wanted to see what would happen if we run that reactor at full power, and then we shut off the pumps that move the coolant through the reactor. I don't know what'll happen. We're in the middle of nowhere in Idaho, right? I mean, bad things could happen. That's why we're in the middle of nowhere. We did that expecting that the reactor would actually shut itself off. The fission process would stop because physics says that if the reactor gets to a certain heat, it will shut off. And as long as the stuff inside the reactor won't melt, you're going to be in a safe scenario. That's what all the modeling said. We did that in the April of 1986, and the reactor shut itself off. It was a totally safe test. Just a few hours later, we did the same kind of thing. We kept the coolant running, but we just shut off the heat sink, the way that coolant can actually transfer its heat ultimately to the environment. We said, I don't know, run it to full power, shut off the heat sink. Let's see what happens. When that happened, the temperature in the reactor went up, the fission process stopped, the thing shut itself down. So that was in a liquid sodium cooled reactor. That's just one example of a type of reactor in this new generation of reactors. We've got a lot of experience running these things. We did those tests in 1986, but Chernobyl happened later in April, so you never heard about it.
I'll just sort of reiterate that in my field, there are studies done from a public perception standpoint that if you say fusion energy, people love it. If you say nuclear fusion, people balk. So it is a largely rhetorical game as well. Ma'am, you had a question or a comment?
No, just a question. I was curious if you guys had a view on how much or how little does the PUE get affected by, solar, wind, nuclear, natural gas, or is that completely over-exaggerated?
Dan, could you?
Yeah, I mean, the PUE is going to be more related to cooling. And obviously, if you can do evaporative cooling, you're going to have a better PUE than liquid cooling. So I don't know how much your source of electricity is actually going to impact your PUE, but that's also not my bailiwick, so I'm out on a limb there.
Any other comments on that?
Sorry, I'll bring it back to nuclear for those who weren't expecting that.
Surprise.
I'll just tell you why I'm asking.
Oh, yeah.
So I've seen every single data center. So in the case of, for example, Google, most of their data centers that are powered, their AI data centers that are powered by sustainable energy resources, they are very close to a PUE of 1.1 or 1.2. And I was curious if there is actually a correlation that you guys have seen, aside from cooling, because obviously, yes, that matters. So that was the point of view I was trying to.
Yeah, now maybe my comment is not relevant, but I'm going to say it anyway. No, because now I see you have a really nuanced question, and I'm going to be way outside of my zone of expertise, but I'll operate there for a moment. I was just going to say that what we are doing, we have ongoing research at Idaho National Laboratory to use excess heat from the nuclear reactor for cooling of data center operations. It's a pretty cool study. We've done some already, but we're doing some more mature studies for that. But what we want to demonstrate is, and that's a great point, PUE and the cooling effect on PUE is a really important thing to understand. So we're saying, okay, well, if we're doing all this research on nuclear reactors and data centers, we might as well consider more effective methods to cool them. And if you've got excess heat from the reactor, great. Put some of it to energy, put some of it to cooling, and you can really improve the PUE.
Let's do one last comment from the field, and then I have one last question for each of you, and then we can wrap. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, I just had a quick question or comment about the nuclear waste component. So I'm from the Great Pacific Northwest, right along the Columbia River. My kids swim 20 miles downriver from the Hanford Nuclear Reservation, so they love it. It's great. But we're on the the south side. We're in the Oregon side of the Columbia River. So Oregon's long had a de facto ban on nuclear until there's a location where we can safely dispose of the waste. So we're really trying hard to get that changed. But I don't know, where do you see, eventually having a place to dispose of it, or we're just going to be disposing of it on site?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad you brought that up because, frankly, I think the spent nuclear fuel discussion should be brought up in venues like this so that we don't appear like we're sidestepping it. I'll make a comment. I'd love to get Doug's comments on the way Radiant is tackling that. For a moment, let me put my January 11th hat on before I retired from Department of Energy. Department of Energy has an office dedicated to spent fuel management, recognizing today that Yucca Mountain in southern Nevada is probably not going to end up being the geologic repository for spent nuclear fuel. We're looking at what does the future look like. The Department of Energy, they are engaged in a process called consent-based siting. One thing that we learned from the 1980s when the Nuclear Waste Policy Act was signed all the way to today, we learned that when you dictate from the top, from Washington, D.C., that some community in the country is going to house the repository for spent nuclear fuel, that community doesn't take kindly to it, right? That's a good lesson to learn. So now, with congressional urging, bipartisan congressional urging in recent years, the Department of Energy has shifted their approach to something called consent-based siting. That means we start small, we engage with the communities, and DOE is doing this in partnership with the national laboratories, including Idaho National Laboratory, to sit with the communities and say, hey, what are your concerns about spent nuclear fuel management? And they can raise their concerns. We can have conversations about those. And so I was involved in late 2023 in awarding funding, grant funding, to 12 partnerships that include communities around the country who actually are interested in hosting spent fuel repositories, temporary or what we call interim storage repositories. They raised their hand for money so that they could look at that a little bit more closely in partnership with their own teams of scientists to get some independent counsel, what have you, and they're currently working through those studies to consider whether they might want to go in, those 12 communities, might want to go to the next phase of exploration on hosting interim spent fuel storage. So that's a pretty cool development. One other point I just want to make before I get off this topic, note that in the entire history of this country's nuclear energy program, those 94 reactors we have today and those that have come before them and already been shut off, that entire spent nuclear fuel inventory would sit on a football field 30 feet high. Like that's all these decades of nuclear power in this country. It would sit on a football field 30 feet high. And oh, by the way, with some of these new reactor technologies that we're investing in and becoming online that can reuse spent nuclear fuel, that block of spent nuclear fuel could power this country for 100 years. Yeah. So we're working on solutions to reuse the spent nuclear fuel, but also I like offering that perspective that we're not talking about a whole lot of volume of spent nuclear fuel in relative terms.
We've just got about 4 minutes left, so I'm going to
Yeah, it's not spent, it's partially used.
Yeah.
Still could be utilized
I'm going to just run a quick question. If you could succinctly give us a wrap for people. So alternative energy, data centers, leave people with 3 or 4 thoughts. Why don't you start, Doug?
I wanted to talk about waste. I think I presented some of the ideas I've got. I'm focused around getting my system to work, right? Making sure that we build 1 megawatt reactors, that we can fuel something next year, that we quickly transition to have products for customers, that those are reliable, that those function. And I'm only focused down on the 1 megawatt size, although we'll always try to help every other community around us with information on materials or regulatory practice or whatnot. That's going to help make it possible for us to build nuclear again. We used to build, on average, only about a nuclear plant in only about 5 years. So the 2 new plants we built in Georgia took quite a lot longer than that. And what we've got to do is go and find what succeeded, what worked before, and without creating any safety issues, you can easily reformat the rules and find these existing templates from when we did things like the experimental breeder reactor, which actually was an extremely efficient 6-month licensing process for a fast reactor with high enriched uranium, with 89,000 gallons of sodium, I think is the
So
figure.
Do you want to just leave the audience with a few bites-sized things
Yeah,
that they might?
yeah, I'll shut up.
Okay.
No, so we can build fast again, is my point. There are a lot of, there's a lot of motion right now on unleashing American energy. We have a National Energy Dominance Council. We have a whole bunch of developers, and we have a lot of private capital. We have a lot of passionate people working on making this fast again, and we can get back to building a gigawatt scale reactor about every 5 years, and we could get 10 or 20 of them in build simultaneously to satisfy this data center demand.
Yeah. Dan, a couple bite-sized chunks for our audiences.
Yeah, I mean, I think on a macro level, there's kind of two things at play. One is the speed at which we're trying to do massive energy projects, which we haven't done in a long, long time, like realistically since the 50s, maybe even earlier, at this kind of growth. Two, at the end of this, there is a massive national security threat. And we are seeing China building a ton of nuclear reactors. They're also building a ton of coal plants. And so they are, building out energy as fast as they can in whatever form they can, and obviously using domestic sources as much as they can, which they can do with nuclear and coal, as they don't have the gas resources that we do. So I think you're going to see a tremendous amount of velocity in gas. I believe that nuclear is a long-term solution. But there's a massive supply chain right here in the next 3 to 5 years. And on-site power is the only thing that's going to solve that problem just because of the state of the grid.
Yeah. Brian.
Yeah, I'll just say, look, for all the years that you all might not have cared that much about nuclear, I love that as I walk around here and engage with you all, your big problem with me is that I'm late, right? I'm late on delivering the solution you want. So that, to me, I see that as a good problem, great opportunity.
Okay. I just wanted to, first of all, thank these incredibly knowledgeable and charismatic panelists, but really also to the organizers of Data Center World for putting us all together in rooms to have these types of sometimes tough but generally optimistic conversations. So thank you very much.